The Light and Shadow of George III, a saga of love, triumph, and tragedy. A king born on the edge. On the evening of June 4th, 1738, as the pale glow of twilight settled over Norfolk House in London, a fragile infant drew his first breath amidst the hushed murmurs of midwives and the distant clatter of servants preparing the household for nightfall. No trumpets blared, no crowds gathered to herald the arrival of George William Frederick, for he was not born to the throne, but as the second son of Frederick, Prince of Wales, and grandson of the stern King George II. In that modest residence, bathed in the flickering light of candles, his mother Augusta cradled him, her weary smile a quiet hope against the uncertainty of his future. No one could have foreseen that this unassuming child, wrapped in soft linens, would one day ascend to the throne and steer England through nearly 6 decades of upheaval, shaping its destiny through the seismic shifts of the 18th and 19th centuries. George's early years unfolded in the shadow of his elder brother, Edward, the presumed heir to the Hanoverian line. A shy boy with a mop of chestnut curls, George preferred the solitude of his books and the intricate dance of clockwork mechanisms to the boisterous games of courtly children. His tutors noted his quiet demeanor, his love for order, and his curiosity about the world beyond the palace walls, traits that hinted at a soul both gentle and restless. Yet fate, with its unpredictable whims, cast a dark shadow over his childhood. In 1751, when George was just 12, his father Frederick succumbed to a sudden illness, a chill that turned to fever and silenced a prince in his prime. The court mourned, but the blow struck deeper when Edward's frail health faltered, whispers growing louder that he might not survive to wear the crown. Thrust from obscurity into the glare of destiny, George felt the weight of expectation settle upon him like a leaden cloak. His days of tinkering with gears gave way to rigorous lessons in governance, history, and the art of kingship, though his heart still yearned for the simplicity of a craftsman's life. In 1760, the wheel of fortune turned again. King George II, his grandfather, collapsed lifeless at Kensington Palace, and Edward's weakened body followed soon after, leaving the throne vacant. At 22, George III was crowned in Westminster Abbey, the golden circlet resting uneasily on his brow. The ceremony was a spectacle of velvet robes and gleaming scepters, but beneath the grandeur, his hands trembled, and his hazel eyes flickered with a mix of resolve and dread. England stood at a crossroads, flush with triumph from the 7 Years' War, which had wrested Canada and India from France, yet burdened by debt and simmering unrest. Unlike his German-born forebears, George was a native son, his English tongue free of the guttural accents that had marked his lineage as foreign. He vowed to be a king of the people, a unifying force in a fractured realm, but the horizon darkened with omens, an empire stretching its bounds, a rebellion brewing in the American colonies, and an unseen torment lurking within his own mind. From the tender joys of family life to the fateful choices of war, from the heights of glory to the depths of despair, George III's reign would weave a tapestry of light and shadow, a story of a man tested by the world and the storms within his soul. Today, we step into his life, witnessing a king imperfect yet profoundly human, whose legacy echoes through the ages, the flame of George and Charlotte. A love beyond time. In the autumn of 1761, mere months after his coronation, King George III stood at the threshold of a new challenge, not of war or policy, but of the heart. At 23, with a crown still an unfamiliar weight, he faced relentless pressure from his court to secure a queen and strengthen the Hanoverian dynasty. His advisors, a dour assembly of wigged nobles, urged a pragmatic match with a German princess to cement alliances across Europe. Yet George, beneath his reserved exterior, harbored a romantic spirit that recoiled at the prospect of a loveless union, the kind he had seen erode the spirits of so many royals before him. "Find me a woman of intelligence and kindness," he told his trusted confidant, Lord Bute, his voice steady with conviction. "Beauty is secondary. I seek a companion I can truly love." After weeks of deliberation, the choice fell upon Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, a 17-year-old princess from a modest northern German duchy, known not for dazzling looks, but for her sharp mind and quiet humility, a selection that sparked murmurs of surprise, but kindled a spark of hope in George's chest. On September 8th, 1761, Charlotte's ship sliced through the choppy waters of the North Sea, docking at Harwich beneath a sky heavy with drizzle. She emerged from the vessel, a slender figure shivering in a silver silk gown that clung damply to her frame, her dark hair pinned hastily beneath a hood. The journey had been grueling, her trunk packed with books rather than jewels, and her command of English limited to a handful of phrases scribbled during the voyage. As she stepped onto English soil, her heart raced with a blend of fear and curiosity, her hands trembling as she clutched the fabric of her dress. At St. James's Palace, George awaited her, his pulse quickening beneath his crimson robe. When she entered the grand hall, curtsying with a grace that masked her nerves, he saw not a radiant beauty, but a young woman with soulful eyes and a presence that spoke of resilience. He crossed the room, took her chilled hand in his, and said softly, "I hope we shall be friends." The warmth in his tone melted her apprehension, and in that moment, an unspoken pact was forged. Hours later, in the royal chapel's dim glow, they exchanged vows before a sparse gathering of courtiers. There were no lavish feasts or trumpets, only the quiet resonance of their promises echoing against stone walls. It was not a blaze of passion, but a tender beginning, a seed planted in mutual respect. Their love grew in the stillness of Kew Palace, where George read poetry by the hearth, Shakespeare's sonnets or Milton's verses, while Charlotte stitched samplers, her laughter a balm to his burdened spirit. She tackled English with fierce determination, her accented tales of German forests enchanting him, and he confided in her his dreams of a harmonious realm. Over the years, their union bore 15 children, their home a whirlwind of cries and giggles, and George, defying the libertine ways of past kings, remained steadfastly hers. "You are my truest companion," he once told her, his hand resting on hers, and she, with a smile that lit the room, called him the gentlest man in England, a title unthinkable for a ruler of empires. Yet their love faced trials that tested its mettle. In 1765, after the birth of their fifth child, Augusta, Charlotte fell gravely ill, her body racked with fever. George, the mightiest man in the land, became a helpless husband, pacing her bedside through sleepless nights, his knuckles white as he gripped her hand. "If you leave me, Charlotte," he whispered, tears glistening in the candlelight, "I'll be lost without you." Her recovery cemented their bond, a love now forged in the crucible of near loss. But darker shadows loomed. In 1788, as George's mind began to fracture, Charlotte confronted a nightmare beyond imagining. One stormy night, he seized her arm, his eyes blazing with delusion, and roared, You mean to kill me, Charlotte. You conspire with them all. She recoiled, her heart splintering, but stood firm, her voice trembling yet resolute. I am your wife, George, and I will never abandon you. Through his descent into madness, she remained his rock, nursing him as he raved and wept. Her love a beacon through the tempest, a flame that burned bright against the encroaching night. The loss of America, a king's agony. By 1765, 5 years into his reign, George III stood on the brink of a crisis that would define his legacy. The rebellion of the 13 American colonies, a rupture that would reshape England and the world. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, had crowned Britain with victories. Canada and swathes of territory wrested from France, but at a ruinous cost. The national debt soared, and Parliament, with George's hesitant approval, turned to the colonies to ease the burden. The Stamp Act of 1765 taxed every paper document, from contracts to gazettes, followed by the Tea Act of 1773, a levy on a staple of colonial life. To George, it was a just request, a father asking his children to share the load of empire. But across the Atlantic, in the smoky taverns of Boston and the rolling fields of Virginia, the colonists saw tyranny, chanting, "No taxation without representation," a cry that reverberated like thunder. In the candlelit chambers of Buckingham House, George pored over maps with Charlotte, his brow creased with confusion. "They are my subjects," he said, his voice tinged with hurt. "Why do they resist me?" She rested a hand on his shoulder, her tone gentle. "Perhaps they crave a voice, my love, as all children do when they come of age." But his counselors preached severity, and when the Boston Tea Party erupted in 1773, colonists hurling crates of tea into the harbor in defiance, George's patience shattered. "They must learn obedience," he declared to Lord North, his words sharp as steel. War loomed, born of pride and a king's refusal to yield. The conflict ignited in 1775 with shots at Lexington and Concord, a spark that flared into a conflagration. George threw himself into the fray, studying dispatches late into the night, convinced that England's might would prevail. "We will crush this insolence," he vowed, envisioning a swift restoration of order. Yet the war stretched into a brutal slog. Bunker Hill's bloody toll, Saratoga's crushing defeat in 1777, and the final blow at Yorktown in 1781, where General Cornwallis surrendered to George Washington amid the smoke and ruin of battle. Each loss carved deeper into George's resolve, his nights haunted by visions of redcoats falling in distant fields. Charlotte watched him waste away, his frame thinning, his eyes shadowed, and pleaded, "You cannot bear this alone, George." But he bore it, a king shackled to his duty. On September 3rd, 1783, the Treaty of Paris sealed America's independence, a dagger to George's heart. Alone in his study, rain drumming against the windows, he sat with a quill poised over his journal. "America is lost," he wrote, his hand shaking, and with it, a piece of myself. The ink blurred with tears as he stared into the void of his failure. A father forsaken, a king humbled. Charlotte found him slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands, and knelt beside him, her arms encircling him. "We still have each other," she whispered, her voice a lifeline in his despair. The loss lingered, a wound that festered through his reign, a testament to the cost of his unyielding faith in an empire that slipped through his grasp. Glory against Napoleon, the guardian of a nation. As the 18th century waned, a new titan emerged from the chaos of revolutionary France, Napoleon Bonaparte, a Corsican genius whose ambition threatened every crown in Europe. George III, now in his 50s, his hair streaked with silver and his hands unsteady, faced this foe with a tenacity born of past scars. From 1793, when France declared war, he guided England through a gauntlet of coalitions against Napoleon, a struggle spanning over 2 decades that would forge Britain into a global colossus. Though he left battlefield command to his generals, George became the soul of resistance, rallying his people with a fervor that belied his aging frame. "We shall not kneel to this usurper," he proclaimed to a roaring crowd in London, his scarlet uniform a beacon of defiance. The war unfolded as a desperate dance of survival. Napoleon's legions swept through Italy, Austria, and Prussia, toppling kings like dominoes. But George and his ministers, chief among them William Pitt the Younger, staked their hopes on the sea. Britain's navy, a fleet of oak and cannon, became the nation's shield. On October 21st, 1805, at Trafalgar, Admiral Horatio Nelson delivered a crushing victory, annihilating the Franco-Spanish Armada and thwarting Napoleon's invasion dreams. The news reached George as he strolled Kew's Gardens with Charlotte, his steps faltering. "Nelson has fallen," the courier gasped, "but the day is ours." George's eyes welled with pride and grief. "He has saved England," he murmured, squeezing Charlotte's hand. That night, London erupted in celebration, bonfires casting a glow over a nation reprieved. The fight raged on, Napoleon's empire swelling until it seemed invincible. Yet George held firm, his spirit a bulwark against despair. In 1815, the climax came at Waterloo, where the Duke of Wellington met Napoleon's forces in a clash that shook the earth. Amid the roar of artillery and the clash of steel, British redcoats stood resolute, driving the French into retreat. Days later, a mud-streaked rider galloped to Windsor with the tidings, "Victory, sire! Napoleon is broken." But George, now blind and lost to madness, sat silent in his chamber, the triumph a distant echo he could not hear. Charlotte wept beside him, her tears a tribute to a glory he could not claim. Under his reign, England had risen from the ashes of America's loss to dominate the world, a guardian king whose light shone brightest in the darkest hours. The darkness, within a king's tragedy. In the fall of 1788, a chill wind swept through Kew Palace, heralding the first shadows of George III's undoing. At 50, he was a king seasoned by decades of rule, yet a fever seized him, spiraling into a delirium that shattered his world. One night, he leapt from his bed, shouting commands to phantom armies, his voice reverberating through the corridors. Charlotte raced to him, her nightgown billowing, and found him wild-eyed, accusing her of betrayal. "You poisoned me, Charlotte," he bellowed, his hands flailing. She froze, tears streaming, but held her ground, whispering, "I am your wife, George, your truest friend." He saw only enemies in the haze of his mind. Physicians swarmed, their remedies barbaric. Leeches, straitjackets, and icy plunges. They dubbed it the king's malady, debating whether it was porphyria, a genetic curse, or the toll of relentless stress. Charlotte fought their cruelty, barring the worst excesses, her love a shield against their ignorance. For a time, he rallied, emerging haggard but sane, and they clung to fragile hope. But in 1811, at 73, the darkness returned with merciless force. Blindness clouded his eyes, deafness dulled his ears, and his mind crumbled, leaving him a stranger to Charlotte and their children. The court handed power to his son, George IV, as Prince Regent, ushering in an era of extravagance amid his father's ruin. In his final years, George III became a wraith at Windsor, a king trapped in a failing shell. One winter day, Charlotte watched him shuffle into the garden, his white hair tangled, and embrace an oak, murmuring, "How fares Prussia, old friend?" Her throat tightened, her love unbroken, even as he faded. He died on January 29th, 1820, alone in his room, his breath slipping away as snow blanketed the grounds. Charlotte had passed in 1818, her heart worn by grief. His tragedy lay not just in the illness, but in the stark divide between the man he was, a devoted ruler, a faithful husband, and the shadow he became, a forgotten king whose light was snuffed by an unrelenting night. The legacy of George III. George III was no flawless monarch. His reign was a canvas of brilliance and blemish. He lost America in the tempest of revolution, a stain that haunted him. Yet he guided England through Napoleon's shadow to unrivaled power, laying the groundwork for a century of dominance. Illness consumed him, casting his final days in darkness. But before that, he was a rare, faithful husband, a tender father to 15 children, and a ruler who cherished the plow over the scepter, a stark contrast to the opulence of his court. When he died on January 29th, 1820, leaving Charlotte's memory and a nation in transition, his legacy was not merely victories or defeats, but a tale of resilience, love, and human frailty against time's relentless march. From Buckingham's halls to Waterloo's fields, from Charlotte's letters to his tear-stained journals, George III embodied an England reaching for the world while bearing its wounds. Today, his story endures, a king tested by fate, never forgotten, a light persisting through shadow, inviting reflection on power, love, and sacrifice in history's turbulent tide.